Welcome, and thank you to everyone for joining us for this memorial to our beloved teacher, Rabbi David Weiss Halivni, founder of the Union for Traditional Judaism and Reish Metivta of the UTJ's Rabbinical School, the Institute of Traditional Judaism. I'd like to offer our sincerest condolences to the entire family. This loss is a personal loss for you, but it is a loss for the entire Jewish world as well. Please note that this program is being recorded. Also, everyone is muted, but we welcome thoughts and comments in the chat. We will invite others to share their thoughts about Rabbi Halivni at the end of the formal program. My name is Rabbi Gerald Sussman, and I am Executive Director of the Union for Traditional Judaism. Before we begin, a few remarks and notes. Thank you to our sponsors for this webinar series. First, those who sponsor in the category of friends. Lewis Book, Ms. Lillian Grodowski in memory of Rabbi Halivni, Rabbi Noah Grodowski, with thanks to the Kadosh Baruch Hu for the privilege of knowing and learning from Rav Halivni. Rabbi Kenneth Green in memory of Rav Halivni, Rabbi Ephraim Halivni, Rabbi Dr. Michael Kaplowitz in memory of Rav Halivni, Professor Peter Cashin in memory of Rabbi David Halivni, Chaplain Leslie Kersner in memory of Rav Halivni, Dr. Barbara Lass, Rosemary Linsider, Dr. Daniel Lassner in memory of Jules Lassner, Rabbi Bob Pilovin, Dr. David Lerner in memory of Rabbi Halivni, Dr. Deborah McCauley, Mr. Mitch Morrison in honor of Rav Halivni's many Talmidim and future generations who draw from his Torah. Rabbi Jonathan Rosenblatt, David Roth in memory of Rav Halivni, Rabbi Isaac Sassoon, Rabbi Solomon Spiro in memory of Rabbi David Weiss Halivni. Supporters, Mildred David, Sanford Hausler in memory of Cy and Muriel Hausner, Lena Kushner, Dr. Hunju Lee in honor of Dr. Yigal Greener, Rabbi Elijah Shochet in honor of Rabbi David Blumenfeld, sustainers, Rabbi Seth Gordon, Mrs. Sarah Kushner in memory of Rabbi David Weiss Halivni, partners, Rabbi Bernie Rotman in honor of Rabbi David Weiss Halivni, Rabbi Marianne Novak, Michael Salzberg in memory of Rabbi David Halivni, and finally benefactors, Rabbi Bruce Ginsberg in memory of Rabbi David Weiss Halivni, Rabbi Edward Schechter in memory of the gentle soul of Rabbi Dr. Weiss Halivni, Rabbi Gerald Sussman in memory of Rabbi David Weiss Halivni. I'd also like to thank everyone who made a donation along with registering for the program. For those of you who are new to UTJ, let me add a few words of introduction to our organization. The Union for Traditional Judaism, the UTJ, is a group of rabbis, scholars, and lay people who advocate for a passionate, open-minded approach to Torah study and observance of Jewish law, halakha, rooted in classical religious sources and informed by modern scholarship. Our philosophy is distinguished by the symbiotic relationship between faith in the God-given Torah and intellectual integrity, and our emphasis on the sacred framework of halakha as our unifying guide. Today, we will have the opportunity to hear from 4 individuals who all had personal relationships with Rabbi Halivni. Our first speaker today is Shai Halivni, the youngest of the three sons of Rabbi Halivni, and Dr. Tzipora Hager Halivni. Shai is an attorney in private practice.
Thank you, Rabbi Sussman, for that nice introduction. And thank you to the UTJ for giving me this opportunity to share a few thoughts as we mark the Shloshim of my father. Clearly, the UTJ embodies my father's belief in intellectual honesty and genuine faith, but the UTJ meant more to him than that. At a critical junction in his life, when his religious and intellectual outlooks were under attack, the Metivta and the UTJ gave him a home and a community. They supported him and everything that was important to him. For that, my family will be forever grateful to the Metivta and the UTJ. The UTJ and each of its individual members has lost its Rosh Yeshiva, mentor, guiding force, and role model. I have lost all that and more. I have also lost my father. And because our mother, Kipora, passed away 14 years ago, Baruch, Ephraim, and I are now without physical parents. So while many of you may have been focused these past 30 days on the loss of a rabbi or a scholar or a mentor or a friend, I have been focused on the loss of my father, the second of my parents. And some of those thoughts are what I wish to share with you this morning. So much has been written about our father since his passing. And Baruch and Ephraim and I have tried to read and respond to all of it. We so appreciate the stories, the thoughts, the feelings, and most importantly, the love and respect that so many of you had for our father. Each and every email, text, post, and blog has brought us some semblance of comfort during this period of unimaginable grief. It reminds me of what my father used to say about his books. Some writers write books that sell 1 million copies in 1 year and then disappear. Others sell only 1 copy a year, but for 1 million years and are always with us. If I had any doubt before, I now know for sure that my father's in the second category. His influence, and I'm not particularly talking about his scholarly influence, will be felt for a long time to come through me, my brothers, our spouses and children, his students, and every one of you who has taken the time to share your thoughts about our father. What is it about my father, the person, that is so enduring? One of the blogs that I read answered the question with the following quote attributed to my father, ostensibly in connection with his faith. I will believe everything I have that I am right, but at the same time, I am human, and the possibility that I am wrong demands that I am open to the paths of others. While I never actually heard my father express this sentiment, it resonated with me because I saw him live those words day after day. He certainly had this intense belief that he was correct in his scholarship and theology. How else can you explain his uncanny ability to look at a daf of Gemara and see things that all the people who studied that same daf over the past 1,500 years never saw? Or claim with any amount of credibility that any type of revelation actually took place at Auschwitz? That takes an enormous amount of conviction. Call it even chutzpah, to have such a confidence that you are right. But he had it. And as I'm sure others can attest to, he was right to have it. But this conviction was evident even when he was not, or it's probably more accurate to say, while he needed this belief to come up with the chidushim that he did, these chidushim also nurtured him and his ability to survive. I was always amazed with his remarkable will to survive, and I attribute that to the Gemara. As long as he had Gemara to learn, no Nazi and no other human foe was going to stop him. That was particularly evident during the last years of his life, when all he wanted to do was get back to the Gemara. That will to survive kept him going through mini strokes, pneumonia, and broken hips. Our family had numerous conversations with doctors over the past 5 years where the doctors expected one bad outcome, but my father decided on a different one. For example, after he broke his second hip and had it replaced, the surgeon warned us that it was a good chance that he would never walk again. Sure enough, the next day he got up and walked. He had this look on his face of, I don't understand what all the commotion is about. Of course I'm going to walk. I have things to do. It was this conviction, the certainness in the correctness of his cause, that enabled him to survive and thrive despite life's obstacles. His conviction was clearly a gift from the Kadosh Baruch Hu. As was written about Yirmiyahu, "V'terem etzarcha v'betem yidaticha u'v'terem tetzei mirechem hikdatishcha." Before I created you in the womb, I selected you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. God gave him this uncanny gift. But unfortunately, God prevented him from using it in his later years. It was very hard to watch our father be so close to the Gemara that he loved. He literally kept it inches from his hands at all times, yet so far in his ability to have new chidushim. And he suffered as a result. My greatest hope is that God is now doing tshuva by letting my father learn with the Stamayim who are on Shemaim with him, so they can finally reveal themselves to him. These people who, despite their best efforts to remain anonymous, were uncovered by my father and given their due. Their turn has finally come to sit with him, learn with him, and answer his questions. Despite his academic achievements and his certainty in his conviction, my father never forgot that he was human, and so was everyone around him. Everyone has something to contribute, and that is how he treated people. He was always willing to learn with anybody, anywhere, anytime. One of his most quoted sayings recently is, "It is my personal tragedy that the people I daven with I cannot talk to, and the people that I talk to I cannot daven with. However, when the chips are down, I will always side with the people that I daven with, for I can live without talking, I cannot live without davening." What is most striking about this passage to me is that he doesn't mention learning. When it comes to learning, he made no distinction. He was willing to learn with anybody, Jew, non-Jew, Apikoros, Talmud Chacham, beginner, old, young, male, female, Shomer Shabbos, or a public sinner. It did not matter. Learning, and all knowledge for that matter, was universal. He was approachable by everyone at the National Library, and he made time for them all. Both of these aspects of his personality, his convictions, and his love of all human beings came from his belief in God. As we say every morning in Berchot HaShachar, Shema Yahavtecha she'ahavta oto u'misimchatcha she'samachta bo. All this came from God's love. This is how my father was able to bring God back into this world after Auschwitz and the revelation of absence that occurred there. My father spent his life in a determined effort to bring God, God's words, and God's mitzvot back into this world. While he was clear, very clear, that the Shoah was a permanent blemish in the universe, he also indicated that men and women can take restorative action to help bring God back. He might have believed that God chose to absent himself from the world during the Shoah, but my father was not going to accept this as a new status quo. Neither my mother nor my father ever gave up hope. They both moved forward in their own ways, notwithstanding the incredible obstacles constantly in front of them. That is what I believe emunah meant to my father, the ability to move forward when all the evidence seems to indicate that one should not be able to. With his passing, there was another permanent blemish in the universe and in me that will never be filled. But just as he found ways to fill the holes in him through conviction and human interaction, I too will follow in his path and attempt to bring the Kadosh Baruch Hu back into this world where the Kadosh Baruch Hu belongs. I don't think that it's a coincidence that my father spent his time trying to bring the Stamayim back to prominence despite their efforts to remain anonymous. His goal, after all, was to bring God back despite his attempts to absent himself. It is safe to say that my father was remarkably successful at recognizing those who needed recognition, whether it was God himself, the Stamayim, or a simple person. All were worthy of his focus. That is a remarkable legacy to leave us with. May the memory of my father, Avi Mori Harab Davi ben Ephraim Betzalel of Fega, be for a blessing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your inspiring words. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Rabbi Ronald Price. Rabbi Price is the Executive Vice President Emeritus of the UTJ. He served as executive vice president for 26 years, beginning in 1985, and as the founding dean of the Institute of Traditional Judaism, the Metivta, from 1990 until his retirement in 2011. Rabbi Price also received smicha from Rabbi Halivni.
Thank you, Rabbi Sussman. Rabbi Novak, president of the UTJ, Rabbi Chacham Isaac Sassoon, who is the Sgan Reish Metivta of the Limudei HaYahudut of the ITJ, the Institute of Traditional Judaism, Dr. Bergmann, Shai Halivni, Esquire, and all the members of the family of our teachers, Zecher Tzadik V'Varacha, Gvirotai Morai V'Rabotai Mechubadim Kulam. I almost don't want to speak after listening to Shai. I have to say that my relationship with his father, which I shudder to think was almost 50 years long, touches many of the areas that he spoke about. But I share with you tonight, I come to you, of course, from Ashkelon in Israel. That's important, primarily because every conversation that Tzipi and I had with Rav Halivni for the last almost a decade and a half began with or ended with, so when are you moving to Israel? Well, we were successful, thank God, in doing so about 2.5 years ago. And that gave us the opportunity to meet face to face with our teacher, our mentor, as Shai said, but also with our Rebbe on a regular basis. To try to summarize a 50-year relationship is virtually impossible. To choose one or two piquant events or moments that we had, some of which were extremely meaningful, difficult, and sometimes extremely humorous, is hard. To choose one that epitomizes what our relationship was like over those years. Our relationship began in really before that, but primarily it was cemented in 1979. Some of you may remember the Conference on Halachic Process. Most of you probably don't remember it because it's covered in the dust of subsequent events. But that moment was a pivotal moment for myself, certainly in terms of the direction of my rabbinic career, and for Rav Halivni, as Shai mentioned and implied, in determining what the trajectory of his future associations were going to be. And I urge you, if you have the opportunity and you want to know more and you did not know the man personally, read his autobiography, read The Book and the Sword, which amazingly tells you about him from the depths of his soul. There was nothing hidden in the man. He shared everything about himself, his fears, the things that caused him angst, the things he loved, the things that gave him joy. Those were the things that made him so human. Yes, he was an incredible scholar. I mean, look at Bekorot and Mesorot if you have the ability to study Gemara with his methodology. But beyond that, he went beyond the ivory tower. He touched us in ways that won't happen again, at least for us as individuals, certainly for me and for my family. We went through tragedies and we went through triumphs together over the course of the years, the creation of the UTJ and the founding of the Metivta. Each of those experiences shaped me personally, certainly, and to some extent, I think also touched our teacher, our mentor, our Rebbe. We shared much Torah, but that's the equivalent of me saying that between Rav Halivni and myself, we knew all of Shas. We knew very well, we all know very well the distance between ourselves and our capabilities and our knowledge base and the universal breadth of thought, intellect, and Torah that he encompassed in his mind. So the Torah that we shared was pretty much one way that he shared with me. And therefore, what I want to do for the few minutes that I have tonight is to allow Rav Halivni to speak for himself as we struggle with what our future will be as his former students, as his Hasidim, if you will, and as his friends. He had some answers for us. In 2008, he approached me with a proposal. He called it a partnership, but it's a partnership much like the partnership that he discussed when he talked about the partnership between man and God. There was God and there was man, and man was the junior partner. So in this partnership, lahavdil, if you will, I was certainly the junior partner. What he asked of me was to speak with him every week, every couple of weeks, sometimes every 3 weeks on the phone. He was in Israel, I was in the States. And he would share with me an idea, a thought on the Parsha, on the Parshiot HaShavua. I would take notes, and the goal was ultimately to publish his thoughts on Torah, on the Parshiot HaShavua. We succeeded in the course of 4 years in putting together a minimum of 3 ideas on every one of the Parshiot, and we're ready to go forward. And in fits and starts, I worked on it, but it wasn't until we were blessed to make Aliyah that I began to work in earnest, because now I could also visit with our teacher face to face and read back to him his own ideas as I shaped them through what we were to call Divrei Halev, words of the heart. I received word from Ephraim, from Rabbi Ephraim Halivni, of the passing of his father when I was in the middle of working on the Dvar Torah from Parshat Ekev in Sefer Devarim. But tonight I want to share with you an idea that he shared with me on Parashat Maseh, which all of us finally came back together on both sides of the Atlantic and read in shul yesterday. Because I think that his words here, again, give us guidance as to how we should be dealing with his loss. Divrei Halev, words of the heart, thoughts of Rabbi Professor David Weiss Halivni on the weekly Torah portion, Maseh, entitled To Journey to Encamp. Chapter 33 of Sefer Bamidbar reviews the journeys and encampments of the Israelites during their 40-year wanderings in the wilderness. Most of the verses include the words Vayisu and Vayachadu. They set out from, they encamped in. Vayisu b'nei Yisrael me Ramses, Vayachadu b'Sukkot. Vayisu b'Sukkot, Vayachadu b'Eitam. The Israelites set out from Ramses and encamped in Sukkot. They set out from Sukkot and encamped in Eitan, etc., etc. Sometimes the journeying seemed longer, almost permanent, than the encampment, and sometimes the opposite. Moshe Rabbeinu records all of these movements. Moses recorded the starting points of their various marches. One explanation for the recording of those wanderings is brought by Rashi. He brings a midrash from Tanchuma. Mashal Melech Shahya beno Choleh, v'holi chol makom rachok l'rapoto. This could be compared to a king whose son was ill and whom he took to a distant place to cure him. When they were returning, the father began to enumerate all of their travels. He said to him, here we slept, here we were chilled, here you had a headache, etc. Rav Halivni continues, the Torah had no reason to record the journeying in such detail except to teach something more than historic minutiae. Before Israel could become a viable nation, and enter the land, the people had to learn and remember the lessons of Vayisu, Vayachanu. The life of a nation, as well as of the individual, consists of travels and encampments. The individual may not always see the distinction between Vayachanu and Vayisu. We may think we have arrived, only to realize that the journey continues. Man is finite and life has an end. That end seems permanent, and life appears to be the journey towards it. It is, in fact, the opposite. We here on earth are Vayachanu. This is just our encampment. Eternity is Vayisu. If while we live, we accomplish Vayachanu well, the transition to the permanent Vayisu will be more bearable. Rav Halivni's Vayachanu was an incredible success. And there is no question that the contribution that he made, the revolutionary contribution that he made to Torah learning and to human kindness, is bringing his neshama ma'ala, higher and higher in his transition to Vayisu. For us, who he left behind, the memories and the texts that he left, as well as the feelings that he engendered in us, will make his transition and our loss at least somewhat more bearable. V'chein yehi ratzon, yehi zichro Baruch.
Thank you, Rabbi Price, for your very inspiring words. Our next speaker is Rabbi David Novak. Rabbi Novak is J. Richard and Dorothy Shiff Chair of Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto and President of the UTJ. He is a recognized scholar in Jewish law and theology. Along with Rav Halivni and the late Dr. Saul Shapiro, Rabbi Novak founded the UTJ in May 1983. He has served on the UTJ panel of halachic inquiry with Rabbi Halivni and currently chairs the panel.
Thank you, Rabbi Sussman, for the introduction. It is a great privilege to participate in this halula, this praise of our recently departed teacher, Rav David Weiss Halivni. There was never a time in the over 50 years that I had contact with him that I didn't learn something important. And when thinking of him, and I'm thinking back to remarks that his son Shai made, there's a statement in the Gemara in Sanhedrin Kuf Daled Amud Aleph, my Bavel, what is Babylon? What is Babylonia? And Rabbi Yochanan says, Belula b'mikra, belula b'mishnah, belula b'talmud. That it is something that encompasses all of scripture, all of the Mishnah, and all of the Talmud, which doesn't mean the literature there, it means the method of learning. And Rabbeinu Tam, the grandson of Rashi, the great medieval scholar whom Rav Halivni had incredible reverence for. In fact, I only remember one time when he actually got angry when somebody denigrated the memory of Rabbeinu Tam. And Rabbeinu Tam says, this is Talmud Shalanu. This is the Babylonian Talmud, Talmud Bavli, what we now simply called the Gemara. And that was, not only did Talmud Bavli include everything, but Rab Halivni's Torah, all of it was within the prism from the prism of a Talmud Bavli. One interesting anecdote is was told to me by the late Rabbi Judah Fish, who was a contemporary of Rabbi Halivni when they were students in the seminary. And he said one evening in the library, Rabbi Halivni, when he was David Weiss then, said to him, Yehuda, you're a Baki in Tanakh. I'm looking for a certain posuk. And he quoted the posuk, but he couldn't remember exactly where it was. And Yehuda grabbed his Tanakh and started flipping pages. And Rabbi Halivni said, never mind, I remember where it is in the Gemara. And that, of course, illustrates how everything was through the prism of Talmud Bavli. My first contact with him, when I came to the seminary after my first year as an undergraduate at the University of Chicago to take Part A, what was of the entrance exam to the rabbinical school, even though I wouldn't be coming there for a few years. I was brought by the late Professor Seymour Siegel to the house of, at that time, Dr. David Weiss and Sipora, Aleha Shalom. And he asked me immediately what I was studying in Gemara, and I mentioned the second parak of Abba Kama, a famous logical question about Kal V'chomer. And he asked what I was studying in the University of Chicago, and I said symbolic logic, among other things. And he took out a pad and pencil and outlined the sugya with logical symbols. That was incredible. And my last conversation with him, I think when I was his last visit to North America, was I did a certain presentation for the UTJ. And he called me aside and he said he enjoyed the presentation. He said, but there's one textual point that you might reconsider. He didn't say I was wrong, but he so gently and privately corrected me, and I appreciated his correction. So today I would like to share something of his Torah Sheba'al Peh, his oral Torah, that I personally engaged with him. And as far as I know, he never wrote. It was not in none of his writings, and I think I've read all of them. But and it was a question that I came to him. There's a passage in the Gemara that troubled me, and the passage is in Masechet Nida, Lamed Amud Bet 30b. And they tell the question they're debating is exactly when does a fetus assume a certain status that if the mother miscarried, it would have she would be tameah. There were certain consequences, and if she miscarried before a certain time, there would be no such consequences. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Yishmael held that a male fetus assumes its special status 41 days after conception, and a female status 82 days, double after conception. Amar Lahem Rabbi Yishmael, the rabbis disagreed with that, by the way. And they said it was simply 41 days, irrespective of male or female. Amar Lahem Rabbi Yishmael, Masa beCleopatra Malkat Yavanit. He said there was an consensus with Cleopatra, the Greek queen. Now, this is interesting because she was in Egypt under the Roman Empire, but in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, Greek was the lingua franca. Shenitchayevu shivchoteha hariga l'malchut. And some of her slaves, female slaves, were guilty of a capital crime. Maybe she set it up that way. One knows. Ubodku matzon zocher la'arba'im v'echad unkeva li'shmonim v'echad, and 1 to 81. 41 days for a male, and they found a female fetus, which was 81. By the way, I said 82 before, it's 81. So he says, he thinks that this is a conclusive proof. Omru lo ein mevi'en raya min hashotim. That seems to be the text in Bavli. You don't bring a proof from shotim. which means people who are insane or mentally challenged, or how one interprets shtut. I asked Rav Halivni, I said, how could they say that Cleopatra was a shota? How could they say that she was, I mean, we know that they were very learned. In fact, the text in the Tosefta that this is based upon says that she's Malkat Alexandrine. She was from Alexandria, which we know was the great center of learning in the ancient world. So how can you say that these were idiots or insane people and whatever? And Rabbi Halivni pointed out to me, he said that you can read it not ein mevi'en raya min hashotim. You don't bring a proof from the idiots or the demented. Ein raya min hasotim, from those who deviate from normal practice. Now, the deviation could be sotim in aragil, that this was an unusual type of thing, and the Talmud frequently says you don't bring a proof from unusual cases. But I thought of this in terms of Rav Halivni, and in terms of his life experience. What Cleopatra was doing was using these female slaves for gruesome medical experiments. Maybe she sentenced them to death so she could use it for experiments. You know, when he entered Auschwitz, his aunt, who was like an older sister, was pushed in the line for Mengele. So I came back to him and I said, could this be that sotim, these are people who deviate from what we consider to be elementary human morality that respects every human being as B'Tselem Elohim and regards the prohibition of shvichut damim to be something which is universally applicable and not only to Jews. So this was an example of where I mentioned this to him and he said that could very well be the case. And if I could read his face at that time, it seems to me that he was saying that he knew where I was coming from because I knew where he was coming from. This is where not only did his love of the Gemara and his memory of the Gemara in the hell of Auschwitz and the hell of the death march afterwards, something that sustained him, but also his life experience, I think, in many subtle ways influenced the way he interpreted the Gemara. Now, Rav Halivni made a great distinction between Talmud and Hora'ah, between the study of the text and the practical application. For example, he said that you would have the mitzvah of Talmud Torah if you studied only the opinions of Bet Shammai, which is never halacha l'maaseh, which is never the norm. And when the late Rabbi Shlomo Faber, Zichrono Livracha, he and I were the beginnings of the panel of halachic inquiry, and I was a member of his Bet Din for many years when I lived in New York in the 1980s. Is we used to come to Rav Halivni with the halachic questions we were dealing with, and he would say, "I'm not going to pasuk in the shayla because I was never a rav. I don't know hora'ah." He would only give us innumerable sources and make suggestions and whatever, but he made a distinction between Talmud and Hora'ah. What the suggestions he was making was, if you want to use it for Hora'ah, that is the question. That is the question I'm proposing to you, and I'm suggesting that I'm giving it to you, and I know that it will be used. I'm not going to apply it, but you have the experience of application. And this interpretation that I got from him and that I expanded upon, and he seemed to agree with my expansion, was something that came to mind in two different halachic issues that I was involved in. One, the question of the use of of data from medical experiments performed by the Nazis, especially Mengele in Auschwitz. And this is a question, Ein Mevi'in Raya min Asotim, don't bring proofs from those who have so deviated from elementary human morality. And then also the question of stem cell research, where people made a distinction between the fetus before 40 days and after 40 days and whatever, and drew all sorts of what I consider to be illegitimate inferences that would, permit abortion for medical experimentation purposes and whatever. And this is where I think what I learned from Rabbi Halivni in this particular instance enabled me to, I think, give responsible halachic opinions in these two areas. So it's this Torah Sheba'al Peh that I remember so well. In all of the conversations, there was never a conversation where there wasn't a reference to the Gemara and where I didn't learn something important and ultimately applicable to real life situations. Baruch Hashem, we had him for so long. We had him in our midst for so long. It was Ud Mutzal Me'esh. He was an ember that was saved from the fire as a survivor of the worst of the Holocaust. And as saddened as we are by his passing, we have to remember, especially his Hasidic background, that this is a halula, this is a praise of God for all that we had from him and with him in this world, and our gratitude to God for having sent him to our midst. Shai mentioned, and I'll close with this, is that Rabbi Halivni wanted to bring God back into the world. It is said, one of the Hasidic Rebbeim, I forget which one said it, is that Moshe Rabbeinu brought the Jewish people to God. The Baal Shem Tov brought God to the Jewish people. David Weiss Halivni, Rabbi Hagaon David Weiss Halivni, Zechron Lebracha, Zecher Tzadik Lebracha, is somebody who, like the Baal Shem Tov, brought God back to the Jewish people, back into the world. Yehei Zichro Baruch.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Novak. Thank you so much for your inspiring words. Our next speaker is Rabbi Dr. Ari Bergmann, author of The Formation of the Talmud, Scholarship and Politics in Yitzhak Halevy's Dorot Harishonim. He earned his PhD studying with Rabbi Halivni. Dr. Bergmann was a senior managing director at Sentinel Advisors, LLC.
Okay, thank you very much for everybody's inspiring words. And what I would like to share with you is a little story the Professor Rabbi Halivni told me. He told me that one of his first jobs, he worked actually at Ellis Island, like screening the people who were coming for the interview, and had to show that they had some kind of a way to support themselves in America. So Professor Halivni told me that he would actually be the translator from Yiddish to English and vice versa. So came a rabbi from Europe, and the immigration officer asked him, so what's your job? What's your profession? So Professor Halivni asked him, so musmakh, what do you do? And he said, Ich bin a Ruf, I am a rabbi. So he tells the guy that he's a rabbi. So I'm sure the immigration officer had heard so many rabbis coming. So he asks Professor Halivni, please ask him, if not a rabbi, what else can he do? So Professor Halivni asked this person coming, he says, if you're not a rabbi, what else can you do? And Jens thought a little bit and he said, I can not only be a rabbi, I can be a Hasidic rabbi. So I asked Professor Halivni told me at that time, something, if not a professor, I think I also could be a Hasidic rabbi. As we heard from the speeches before, he comes from a Hasidic family and his wife. And at that time, I told Professor Halivni, something, I think you are already a rabbi. I think the combination of Professor Halivni was a professor and what's called the Litvish learning that he had, that they made him, as we know, at JTS, Professor Lieberman made him into a Litvak, but he was at heart also a rabbi, a Hasidic rabbi. His love, his care was unbelievable. We know that Professor Halivni, I think that his ability to hear the word of the Stamayim was because he was a keen listener. He always listened, he always followed, he always looked at things. His ability to discern who is speaking is because he always listened to people. He always cared. Every time I met with him, he always asked me how I was doing, how I cared, how I was growing. He was an amazing listener, not only to the Gemara, but actually to people and to his students. I remember I had him as a guide on my PhD dissertation, and also as a chavruta for over 15 years on the phone from Israel. And there was always something to be learned, but not only there was always something to be learned, there was always something that he heard and listened to me. Every Sunday, he would ask how my week was, how I am doing. He would be a keen listener. And even when I had something bothering me and I didn't tell him, he would know that something was bothering me. Truly, that amazing combination. I think what Dr. Novak just before mentioned, the Jewish people to God, and that the Baal Shem brought the God to the people. That combination of Moshe and Baal Shem is Professor Halivni, combining a role of a rabbi and a professor. And I've seen and witnessed that that's so unique. And I think his ability to listen, to understand, not only the idea of the Gemara, and that's a lesson that I learned from him, is that the first issue is that when we learn the text, when we learn the Talmud, it's so important to know who is speaking, who is saying what. Because we must first to listen, to discern. It is the stam, because for so many years, the voices were basically quiet. We couldn't discern. It was just scrambling. The unscrambling of the voices, the unfinding of the stamayim, was the keen listening. And that's something that I've learned, that when you learn any sugya, the most important is to listen who is speaking. When I tell my students is, forget it. You have to look and hear who is saying what. And it's not only on the Gemara. His knowledge and his ability to hear and to listen extrapolated to so many things. I remember he mentioned the Yad Malachi. The Yad Malachi quotes the Chavot Yair, that the Chavot Yair says that one of the rulings of the Talmud, that the Talmud will not discuss an opinion unless it held it for halacha, not to the stam of the Gemara, which Professor Halivni said, that's what he is. The stam is totally different. It comes to explain, to elaborate, to reconstruct, and he does all of it, even on something that he doesn't hold of halacha. And the Ad Malachi asks and says, 1 second, what's the difference between the stama of the Gemara and the Amoraim? Both are Amoraim. So if the rule applies to Amoraim, that they don't discuss something unless they hold that this is the same should apply to the stam. And that's what Professor Halivni says, if you listen keenly to the Gemara, there are two different approaches and there are two different voices. He was able to see these voices in the Gemara and the Yad Malachi, that his view of the Stamayim and the different role of the Stam, it's not his chidush. He was able to hear this in the previous authorities. And he always looked for sources before. Here is the Chavot Yair. And then there is a Reef in Chuli. And then there is a Rosh Tosfot. His ability to listen is to show that his own chidush, he didn't take for himself. He says, if you pay attention carefully, this is bringing voices, not back only from the Stamaim, but that sensitivity was already brought before in the time of the Rishonim, the Achronim, and so on. And that's a lesson for all of us. I think that for me personally, we know that because if you have to listen, you could learn from anybody. Professor Halivni told me not only how to be able to hear the Gemara, but to hear people and to see the truth which is there just by listening. We will miss him sorely, but I think that our mission as people and as members of the community, as members of the academia, is to continue his legacy and to teach our students, to teach our family, to teach ourselves, that many times it's not important what to say, it's much important to listen. Because by listening and hearing who is saying what, you could reconstruct, you could solve problems, and you could see the truth, which is all evident. Yeh zichro Baruch, and may we continue his legacy.
Thank you so much for your words and also for your good advice. This concludes the formal program. And so before we open to the floor and invite others to share the remembrance of Rabbi Halivni, I'd like to again thank all of our speakers and sponsors, and again share all of our condolences with the family. If you haven't already, please join our email list by filling out the form on utj.org. You'll find it linked under Contact Us. And please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. As we open for comments, I'd like to ask if there are any other members of Rabbi Halivni's family here with us who would like to share their thoughts. If so, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone. This is Baruch. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad. Thank you for sponsoring this event, and I am so glad that I've been able to join you. I was traveling today and was very fearful that I would be in transit and unable to join. Thank you all for the warmth you've showed him, the respect you've shown him, and demonstrated that he will live in all of our collective memories. I wanted to share a short thought. Shai's already spoken so eloquently on behalf of the family. I've been thinking of late of his last few years. You've all spoken of Abba when he was vibrant, when he was at his best, when he was able to think clearly, when he was when no day would pass without additional chidushim. The past few years he was not quite at that level. And in fact, there were two periods in his life, and only two periods in his life, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu literally prevented him from learning. One, of course, was when he was 16. And we all know what happened then, and he's written about that. And he tried to explain what God could possibly have meant to achieve by visiting the Holocaust on the Jewish people and in the big picture, and depriving his Eloi of his ability to learn for that period. But what Abba hasn't written about, and which I've been thinking about, is why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu do it to him again? Up until about the age of 90, Abba was operating at 120% of capacity, both physically and mentally. On Shabbat, although he lived on the 11th floor, he wouldn't take the Shabbos elevator. He would walk. Up almost maybe 89 or 90, he would walk. Nothing wrong with the Shabbos elevator, but he would walk. He confessed to me once in his late 80s that he had started to rest on the 7th floor for a few minutes on his way up, as if he were confessing to some sin. And I said, Abba, you're allowed to rest when you go up the stairs, and you can even take the Shabbos elevator. And I use that example to illustrate his mental capacity was the same. And he was working on zvachim and menachot, which were incredibly difficult as he labored through Mekorot and Mesorot. And then at some point, about 5 years ago, we think he suffered a series of mini strokes, and it was torture for him. He lost enough of his cognitive ability to cry to me. He would cry and say, Baruch, I sit here with the Gemara, I have no more chidushim. I have no more chidushim. I can't tell you how painful that was. But God didn't deprive him of so much cognitive ability that he wasn't aware of the fact. He was aware of the fact that he wasn't learning like he used to. And I've thought about, like, why did God have to do this to him again? And I have a little midrash that is very satisfying to me, which I'll share with you. Maybe it will resonate with you, maybe it won't, but I so yearn for an explanation. And that is, we all know the power of Torah. We all know, we may remember a story of another David HaMelech, so long ago, who was predestined to live a certain number of years, and when his 70th year came, he sought to forestall the inevitable by learning Torah. And indeed, the Malach HaMavet could not reach him, could not touch him, until, as we know from the story, the Malach HaMavet had to create a diversion, a noise that caused David HaMelech to stop briefly learning Torah. And it was at that moment that the Malach HaMavet was able to strike. So David HaMelech was a very busy man, and he learned a lot of Torah, and he composed Tehillim and a lot of other things. But Abba was not busy waging wars and doing the other things that the earlier David had done. He was learning Torah all the time. And the only way I could explain to myself why this happened to him was there was no other way that, there was no other way that the Malach HaMavet could reach him. And so God, in his infinite wisdom, felt that the only way to have the inevitable happen was to have this David stop learning Torah. And that was encapsulated in David HaMelech's pasuk, Lulei Toratcha she'ashuai az avadati be'ani. If your Torah would not have been my delight, I would have died in my affliction. And that was an affliction that he suffered from for the past few years. It was the Torah was no longer sha'ashuai. He could no longer learn. The Kiddushim were gone. And that's when he was avadati be'ani. That was the only way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu could make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you again, and thank you so much for sharing this with us. This is the end of the formal program, so feel free to sign off if you would like. Several people have asked to be recognized to share their thoughts, and I will recognize them one at a time. As I recognize you, please unmute yourself. Please keep your comments to no more than 2 minutes so we can get to as many people as possible. First, I'd like to call upon Dr. Mark Kaplan.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak, Rabbi Sussman. Thank you, everybody, for paying attention. I'm not a Talmud Chacham. I was not one of Rabbi Halivni's formal students, but I consider myself to have been a very close friend of his during the late 90s and the early part of the current millennium, when I davened every Shabbos at KOE and with Rabbi Halivni at Ramat Hara. And I want to talk about briefly one aspect of his life and his character that I think a lot of people overlook. And that is his profound connection to the Yiddish language and to Yiddish culture. And he spoke to me many times about his magnificent immortal memoir, The Book and the Sword, saying that he wished he could have originally written it in Yiddish, and he actually contemplated having someone translate it into Yiddish for him. There's two quick stories I want to say about Rabbi Halivni's connection to Yiddish and my connection to him through that common devotion. One time we were sitting together at Ramat Hara on 110th Street. It was a Friday night. There was a guest rabbi, and the guest rabbi was one of our modern brethren who wanted to be clever and wanted to tell a little joke. And he said, I just learned the word in Yiddish for a next door neighbor. If you want to say a next door neighbor in Yiddish, you say next door neighborke. And he was expecting a big laugh line and nobody laughed. And Rabbi Halivni turned to me and said, what was the man saying? What did he say? I said, he meant a next doorke. And this was a level of communicating with Rabbi Halivni, a level of understanding Rabbi Halivni that I think to a certain extent one could only achieve through the Yiddish language and in the Yiddish language. And I felt very privileged to have that kind of a conversation with him every Shabbos, every week that I saw him, and many times during the week. And a little anecdote to conclude my remarks. When I first began to visit Rabbi Halivni regularly in his apartment in New York City and really get to know him more intimately than just another member of KOE. First time I visited him, I was looking for his name on the buzzer, and I was surveying all the people who were in the same apartment building as he. And I noticed that one of the names on the buzzer was Saeed, Columbia faculty housing. So I went up to Rabbi Halivni's apartment after I found the buzzer, and I said, Rabbi Halivni, I noticed on your buzzer there was a Saeed. Is das der Emeser Saeed? Is that the real Saeed? He said, maybe the not so real Saeed, but it's really him. 2 weeks later, Rabbi Halivni invited me to his apartment for Slivovitz during Pesach. This was a big honor. And people said, he invited you up to his apartment for Slivovitz, no less. You're really in the inner circle. So we were going downstairs to daven mincha, Saturday mincha at Ramat Hara. And Rabbi Halivni had hurried down the stairs by himself, as was his practice. And I was going more slowly with Geveret Sapora. Maybe we even used the elevator. But as we were crossing the lobby and Rabbi Halivni was waiting for us outside, the elevator doors opened very grandly. This magnificently dressed gentleman came out. I ran up to Rabbi Halivni. I said, "Ich hab ihn gesehen, bekvoido uva atzmoi." And this was 2 weeks after our previous conversation. And Rabbi Halivni just looked at me and he said, "Saeed?" So there was a way of communicating with Rabbi Halivni that could only, I think, be achieved through the Yiddish language. And I want to commemorate that. And finally, final sentence to speak of my own destination in the world of Yiddishkeit. I find myself less and less interested in shitas and in hashgachas and in chumrot, and more interested in stories and in memory. And it's in my memory of those personal experiences with Rabbi Halivni that that my path in Yiddishkeit remains set and remains an ongoing process of discovery. Ken Yehi Zikroi Baruch. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to call upon Rabbi Bruce Ginsberg, who now is a resident of Eretz Yisrael, past president of the UTJ.
Thank you, Rabbi Sussman. I am speaking to you from Modi'in, from the home of one of our daughters. And I'll get back to her in just a moment, but I'd like to focus on Rabbi Halivni's humility. I think a lot of times when we think of humility, we think of a person who doesn't fully appreciate his own place in the world. So I do want to focus on Rabbi Halivni's humility. I think most of us generally view humility as a quality of a person who doesn't really appreciate his own place in the world or underestimates his own value. I don't think that's the case as we would define it Jewishly speaking. I think in terms of Moshe Rabbeinu, certainly he was not unaware of his own special place in the world. He knew that he was more intimate with God than anybody else. And yet he's described as the most humble human being of all time. I think in some similar fashion, Rav Halivni was a person who understood his place in the academic community. He knew that he was blessed with gifts beyond the fondest imagination of others, even who have achieved the most in the academic world. And yet he was an incredibly modest person, an unassuming person. I share just a couple of things in that regard. As I mentioned, I'm speaking from Modi'in, from the house of a daughter of mine. She was married some 17 years ago here in Israel. Her husband at that time was a rabbinical student at Har Etzion Yeshiva, and the entire yeshiva came, the rabbanim, the bachurim, their whole set of friends, members of the family. We had many people at that wedding. It was our zchut that Rav Halivni did officiate under the chuppah at that time. And it would have only made sense that shortly after the chuppah, perhaps the first dance, that he would have discreetly removed himself from the festivities. That was not the case with Rav Halivni. He was there to celebrate with family from beginning to end. And as being the father of the bride, there was no way that I could give him the attention that he, in my view, fully deserved. No, he was fine with that. If he didn't have the time to spend with me or my wife, Rachel, who had been a master's of Talmud student with him, and he always would mention that fact when we were in his presence, he spent time with my sister and brother-in-law who would come in with their daughter, my niece, from the United States, and he spent the evening with them. That was okay. He was incredibly unassuming. One other quick illustration of that is on one of my trips to Israel, I picked up the phone, I gave him a call. I said, Rav Halivni, I really want to treat you to lunch. Choose any restaurant in Yerushalayim, whatever is your favorite restaurant, that's where I'd go. I'd love to spend some time with you. I'll treat you to lunch. He said, meet me at the National Library. So I went to a seat in the National Library. We spent a little bit of time in the National Library. Then he said, now we can go to lunch. So I said, so what place did you choose that we should go? He said, I'd like to go to the faculty dining room. I said, that's where you want to go? You could go to any restaurant in Yerushalayim. No, that's where I want to go. We've got very good food there. We go down there, we order our meal, and before I can bat an eyelash, he's paid the bill. As you can imagine, I was aghast. That was not my intention. He brushed it off with a chuckle and gave me a look like, this is non-negotiable. Let's just enjoy each other's company. That was Rav Halivni, totally unassuming, not expecting or wanting his students to fawn over him. He was trying to create independent minds and independent thinkers. And it was precisely that chena which stays with me. I did have the opportunity during the last handful of years that others have mentioned, Baruch in particular made mention of them, when I would come into Israel and visit at the Wolfson Towers on Diskin and spend some time with him, sometimes in the company of my wife, sometimes alone. The last time of which was almost a year ago to the day exactly when we did visit with him. I do know that some of my Talmudic superiors who visited him within the most recent years had a greater sense than I did of the academic loss that they had sensed and that Baruch, for instance, acknowledged. for me, that was not the experience I had. I know for some of my colleagues, they were brokenhearted and distraught when they realized that a certain change had taken place. All I can tell you is my experience was that the chema of Rabbi Halivni was fully intact. His upturned smile, the glow of his face, his sparkling eyes, his sense of welcome, his sense of appreciation. It was those things that I continued to see, absolutely unchanged. And I and my wife left that last encounter uplifted and fully inspired. And that will always stay with us. Yitzhak Baruch.
Thank you, Rabbi Ginsberg. I'd now like to call upon Rabbi Marianne Novak.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here to recognize one of my teachers. I'm going to speak not so much from the academic point of view, but to my experience with Rav Halivni. Rav Halivni was an experience in my household even before I became a student of his. As my father mentioned, they were great colleagues. My father, who didn't mention this necessarily, but whenever my father would have be stuck on a piece of Talmud or whatever it was, he would call Reb David, and Reb David would fix it in 2 seconds. He would untangle it in 1 minute, and he would put it down, and he would say to me, Marianne, this is a true genius. And I'm saying this nicely. My father does not say that about hardly anyone. So when he made it, I made a note. I made a mental note. And when I started Barnard, this was at the time that Professor Halivni had moved to teach at Columbia, and I had a chance to study with him. And I think I was one of the few people in the room at the time who actually knew that I was studying with a genius, which admittedly was a little bit intimidating. Although I did introduce myself and say, hi, I'm David's daughter. That's what I do when I meet my father's colleagues. I was just at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem for a rabbi training seminar, and for a bunch of folks there, that's how I introduced myself with great pride and no shame in doing that. And I remember writing my notes very carefully, and the way that he had just the demeanor about him was so different. At the time that I was at Barnard and Columbia, I was a political science major, and a lot of the teachers there had huge, overwhelming, charismatic personalities. Not that they were such great scholars, but they had just a cult of personality about them. I remember one particular teacher who I took in the freshman year for a political science seminar, and everyone said you had to take it, and I thought it was great. And then by the time I took it as a senior, I wasn't so enamored anymore. And so to sit in Professor Halivni's classroom was to sit with greatness and humility, as I believe Rabbi Ginsberg had talked about, humility, not in a way that it was, that he would play down his strengths, but knew his strengths, and to see someone of great knowledge and charisma and just incredible landus, but at the same time, it wasn't all about him. And to find someone with that kind of ego intact is a rarity in academia. It's a rarity today more than ever. And so to be privileged to learn in that way, and to understand that you can achieve those great things without the overwhelming mantle of personality, which in our day is even more amplified because of social media and all those kind of things in order to make yourself known and appreciated, was a real lesson for me, and something that I take with me as I do my own scholarship and as my work as a rabbi. So I also luckily have Shai and Diane live here in the Chicago area, and got to know them well. And Diane is a close friend, and I got to learn about Professor Halivni as Saba, as not just the professor, as not just the great mind, but someone who was their Saba. And that was important to know, that the humanity makes his lamdos even more extraordinary. That the personal pieces of making it not just something that is ethereal or unattainable, but those things that make it real because of his real personhood. And we have lost, it's such a great loss that we have, but all of us have merited to be in the presence of someone embodying all those qualities. And that I know that we will take that all forward with us as we continue.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd now like to call upon Rabbi Elijah Shochet.
Thank you. For several years in the 1950s, I would watch Professor Halivni, then he was simply known as David Weiss, walk. I would watch him walk. It would be in the seminary library. He had his makom kavua in the last row, right-hand side of the library. And every few minutes, he would get up and he would start walking. He would start pacing back and forth, engrossed in thought. And he really did not see mamish where he was walking. He crashed into chairs, into tables. He bumped into people. And then he would very sweetly, in an embarrassed way, apologize. He really didn't see with his eyes. He was transported into a different world. He was swimming in the Yam HaTalmud, and he was totally unaware of the physical environment surrounding him. And I couldn't help but think that perhaps the reason why he survived the hell that he did in Europe was because he always had, figuratively, symbolically, if not literally, a Gemara in his hands. And that transported him into a different world in which he lived. We all know Professor Heschel's famous phrase, I was praying with my feet. I was davening with my feet. For me, Reb David was learning with his feet. And he learned beautifully, inspirationally. Tehei nishmasot sh'rora b'tzror hachayim. Thank you.
Thank you again so much. I'd now like to call upon Professor Abba Engelberg.
I am a neighbor of Ephraim Halivni, and through Ephraim, I got to know and to host both Ephraim and Rav David Zichrono Livra. I had one memorable discussion with him that showed not only his brilliance, but his understanding of how to apply Talmudic law to everyday current events. It had to do with a midrash on the pasuk in Kohelet, which talks about dimata ashukim, the tears of the oppressed. And the pasuk, there was nobody to comfort these oppressed. Umiyad oshkehem koach. But there actually are oppressors that do have the power to comfort them. The ein lahem menachem, but still they do not do that. Interestingly enough, the midrash applies this pasuk to the case of a mamzer. It says that a mamzer, of course, is a terrible situation to be in, and the victim is totally innocent. And they blame, of all people, who are the Oshkehem, who are the oppressors? They are the Sanhedrin itself. The Sanhedrin did not work hard enough to free a mamzer, which is an amazing thing because it's a law in the Torah. You expect the Sanhedrin to go against the law of the Torah, and yet the Midrash blames the Sanhedrin for not working hard enough. And what Rav David had to say about this, and I thought this was showed a beautiful understanding of some of the halachic problems that we experience in today's world, is that today, instead of mamzerim, we have to say that this refers to mesuravot get, to women whose husband is depriving them of a get, and he felt that the rabbis have not worked hard enough to find a solution for those women. And that is a thought that has stayed with me, even though it's probably 10 or 15 years since he told me that. And I think it shows his involvement not only in Talmudic and Midrashic knowledge, but in the workings of the Jewish world today. Yehi zichro baruch.
So now I'd like to call upon Dr. David Lerner, but if he's under the weather, and we wish him good health, then perhaps Noah may read the statement from him.
I believe he's not here. Reported that he was unwell. If you are here, please jump in. Otherwise, I'm going to read what he wrote. He wrote, I got to know Rabbi Weiss Halivni through KOE, where I was very involved for about 15 years when I lived in New York. I'd like to share a few short anecdotes that reflect some of his memorable qualities. First, when I first came to KOE, I had heard of Rabbi Weiss Halivni as a great scholar, but I had never met him. He was sitting unassumingly in the middle of the rows of chairs, certainly not in the front of the room. I think I figured out who he was because everyone else looked younger. After davening, he came over and greeted me, asked my name and where I was from, then, to reassure me about the various innovations of the man, gave a short and shy smile and said, "We do things a little differently here, but it's all right." To me, this was a sign of his warm, welcoming nature and also his humility. And every time I saw him after that, he always greeted me with a warm smile. Secondly, from sitting near Rabbi Halivni on many Shabbat mornings, I noticed something unique about his personal tefillah. In the Av HaRachamim, which was written as a memorial to the victims of the Crusades, but is applicable to all martyrs, variants of the word dam, blood, appear 5 times. Rabbi Weiss Halivni would daven softly, but for each of those 5 words, he would raise his voice slightly, not necessarily to be heard by other people, but to add a little bit of emphasis, maybe an extra nudge to Hashem to avenge the martyrs. I never discussed it with him, but I'm sure it reflected the lasting impact of his experience in the Holocaust. I'll always remember that, and sometimes remember to say Av HaRachamim the same way he did. In a related story, when KOE relocated from the nursing home to the youth hostel, I was told that Rabbi Weiss Halivni approved of the new location when he noticed that the room, which was a non-denominational chapel, happened to have a plaque memorializing the victims of the Holocaust. Finally, I always think of this teaching at this time of year since it is related to Tisha B'Av. I heard this not directly from him, but from a friend who also davened at KOE, Amy Kahan Aleha Shalom. So I hope I'm representing it accurately. Apparently, Rabbi Weiss Halivni taught that one difference between the fast of Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av is that the main point of Yom Kippur is the personal inuyim, affliction, whereas the point of Tisha B'Av is to share in the communal mourning of the destruction. So that the practical difference is that if you feel sick from fasting on Yom Kippur, you can stay home, perhaps lie down, but should try to keep fasting. But if you feel sick on Tisha B'Av, you might break your fast in order to be able to go to shul and join in the communal tefillot and kinot. For me, these examples encapsulate some of Rabbi Weiss Halivni's traits, not only scholarship, but also warmth, humility, and an emphasis on communal memory and communal solidarity. It was truly a privilege to get to know him and daven with him for many years.
Rabbi Stanley Asakoff.
I had to unmute myself. So
Okay.
my connection with Rabbi Halivni was basically when I was at the seminary. I took a course with him for a year. That was my connection. But it was, you didn't have to be in his presence very long to know that you were with a great scholar and a great human being. But I would like to share a ma'aseh shahaya. A couple of years after I finished the seminary, it was out on the Columbia campus. I had arranged to purchase a Macintosh computer from Columbia. I picked it up on at 116th Street in Amsterdam, and it was 3 huge boxes. I was alone. I had to carry them across the campus to 116th Street and Broadway, where I had parked my car. So I'm schlepping these 3 big boxes. I pick one up, move it 10 feet, go back to the other 2, move them. I get almost across the campus and I hear someone say, "Asakoff, what are you doing?" It was Professor Halivni. I explained to him the situation and he said to me, "You can't do that by yourself." He ran over, he picked one of the big boxes up and helped me carry them to my car a few blocks away. And I will always remember that story of someone who truly was just a wonderful mensch and a wonderful human being. And I also would like to share one other ma'aseh shahaya that I'm still thinking about, but I will reflect it as accurately as I can. After one of my classes, I was very perplexed because I knew that Professor Halivni was very observant, and yet he approached the Talmudic text in what was certainly an unorthodox way in terms of analyzing it, taking it apart, putting it back together. And I went to him and I said to him, as a frum person, how can you approach the text the way you do? And he said to me, and it was a very short interchange, "Asakoff, yes. Did you ever see train tracks? Yes. Do you know that they're parallel? Yes. Do you know that they don't meet? Yes." And that was the end of the discussion. And I am still pondering that and thinking about that today. But those 2 anecdotes represent for me my having been blessed by being touched with an unusual human being, a wonderful Jew, an amazing scholar, and a wonderful gift to the world. And although I was not blessed with the personal relationship that so many of you have had, he has touched me in ways that go with me from those 2 days until today. Yehi zichro Baruch, may his memory be for a blessing. And I would like to just to say one thing else. I always wondered, what does it mean when you say, may someone's memory be for a blessing? What does that really mean? To me, it means that if I remember that person and remembering him, I do a good deed or teach something that he would have taught in his lifetime, then he is still alive and he is still a blessing in the world of the living. And thank you for the opportunity to remember a great scholar and a great human being.
I'd like to call upon Lillian Grudowski.
My mother had to leave, so I'm going to maybe take my two minutes or so at this point and share, first of all, her regrets that she had to leave, but she wanted to share with people her thoughts of his very gentle soul, how she appreciated the mentor that he was to me, and that her heart broke at hearing of his loss. And she mentioned in particular his warmth, something that we've heard from a number of people. And it strikes me that among his many, many wonderful qualities, he was an embodiment of the words of Shammai, Hevema Kabelet Kol Adam B'Sever Panim Yafot. He received people with a genuine warmth and caring that was always so touching. And with that, if I may continue to share some of my direct thoughts, it was mentioned for someone who was as knowledgeable and as sharp as he was, he relished in hearing other opinions, and you would go to a shiur of his and people would challenge him at every moment, and there was no pique, no insult. It was just we were all partners in searching for Torah. And I think the way he received challenges and was willing to change his own opinion and had this opinion changed by others, was part of his sense, I think, both of his respect for others, but also something I think Shai highlighted, his sense that Yosher Dat, that intellectual honesty, and maybe also his sense of the imperfections of transmission of Torah led to a sense of humility on his own, that anything he said, as much as he believed it, but was still searching for truth and open to other possibilities. And that was always inspiring part of his commitment to faith and intellectual honesty. And on the subject of intellectual honesty, I remember, for instance, one time hearing a drasha at another shul, and he came to me and said, "You heard what he said, XYZ, that's not true." I was like, well, maybe there's a little bit of poetic license in a drasha. And he said, but not to say something that's not true. And I learned to be careful with my drashot, but also he was just sharp in his insistence on honesty above all things. I remember, for instance, at KOE, when he was asked about having women have aliyot, which he was clearly uncomfortable with. When he spoke, the first thing he told us was about a source that I've never heard anyone reference before or since, that suggested that Rashi allowed women to have aliyot at a Shiva minyan, because that wasn't considered a tzibur, a public. No one had heard this before, I'm sure, in the room. No one probably heard it referenced again. And Rabbi Halivni, who was uncomfortable at the very least with some of these developments for sociological reasons, could easily have not mentioned it. But his first duty was to teach Torah with honesty and to present the sources that way. And if he had misgivings for other reasons, he would share those misgivings and the reasons for them, and not try to cover up anything that was in Torah. To me, there were people in the room who were not happy necessarily with the whole talk, but I thought it was the moment I learned most about both Rav Halivni and how one should conduct oneself as a rabbi and a teacher. Two other thoughts. One is that while he was certainly strict and demanding of himself and taught his students to be machmir on themselves, but mekel on others, he also gave a sense that sometimes you just have to think a little bit, and it's not, it seems to me sometimes that some people make the error of taking the letter of the law strictly, and that's that. And some people are just too quick to dispense with the letter of the law when it's not convenient. Rav Halivni was certainly very strict, but also had a certain seichel about it. And a couple of vignettes. One was on Simchat Torah. Once in the evening, we were at a shul, and I asked him about the idea of reading Torah from on Simchat Torah. One of my teachers, Rabbi Alan Uter, who's here, I've always spoken about that subject. And Rav Halivni agreed that there were problems with it, and there were concerns. And then, of course, Rav Halivni was called for the third aliyah. And he took the aliyah, and on coming down from the bima, said to me, "I want to see the person who goes to Gehenna for laning." And I thought it was a perfect point of the reality of situations. One is a story that I learned from, I don't remember which of his children once, about how he pushed a wheelchair up 116th Street, I think it was, a very steep hill on Shabbat. And his son asked him, how could you do that? We don't have an eruv here. And his answer was simply, how could I not? And finally, a story he told once about how when medical students, aspiring medical students might ask him for a recommendation for medical school, he would ask them the question, well, what happens if you get a call on Shabbos and there's a patient of yours who's in an emergency, who's not Jewish, what do you do? And he says, some people would say, well, this is my patient, I have an obligation to take care of him, I have to go do what I have to do. And some people say, well, I have to learn from my rabbi and ask what the halachot are. And he says, for those people who say they would ask a question, for them, I don't write a recommendation. And it reminds me of the Shulchan Aruch that tells us that when it comes to saving a life on Shabbat, that hazariz harezi meshubach v'hashoel harehu k'shofech damim. The one who does it quickly, all the better. The one who asks the question, it's as if the person has spilled blood. I think those stories all kind of combine for a sense that Rav Halivni, beyond the letter of the law, and I'm sure in each one of these cases, he could have written you a tshuva about why halacha was in accordance with his feelings. But that at some points, and particularly in the moment, sometimes you have to have seichel and know what the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants from you. I'd like to close really with thinking about his closing remarks to the way I first related to him. I later had the honor of smicha from him, but I first related to him as a congregant at KOE. And when he made Aliyah, his final talk before he made Aliyah was all about his jealousy for Korban Habayit. And this is appropriate as we come to Tisha B'Av. And he explained how, thousands of years later, people mourn Korban Habayit with such a sense of loss and such a sense of tragedy on Tisha B'Av, and that he was jealous of it because he wondered and worried if the memory of the Holocaust would have such a palpable meaning to the Jewish community in future generations. And of course, that's an important message in and of itself. And I always try to remember on Tisha B'Av to mourn more for the victims of the Shoah than for a building in Jerusalem. But the other point that I think it showed, here was a congregation that he had led for years that had tremendous success. It was the most beautiful davening I've ever been to. By the way, he was a beautiful Baal Tefillah and lent to the beauty of the davening, whether he was at the Amud or not. But the fact that this groundbreaking minyan that had such innovations, had such success, in the end, his final message to his community was remember the Shoah, and to keep that memory alive and meaningful and important to the people. And I think that's an important message to share with him as we remember his memory.
Thank you, Noah. And I also want to thank you for all that you've done in order to make this program possible and make it happen, and to thank everyone else who helped make this happen.
Rabbi Kalmakoff as well.
Yes, especially Rabbi Kalmakoff. Without Rabbi Kalmakoff, it likely would not have happened, but I want to make sure that I probably missed some people, but still. I want to thank all the speakers, because each of them said something a little bit different and brought out something of the spirit of Rabbi David Weiss Halivni. And so those pictures, those images remain in our minds as a source of inspiration always. And I want to say, Yehi Nafsho Baruch, but not only that his soul be blessed, but we be blessed by his soul and his inspiration and all that he exemplified for all of our lives as well. And let us all say to that, Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
We're happy to leave the Zoom open if people want to speak at all, but this will conclude.
Okay. Everyone is welcome to sign off, but we'll keep the microphone on a little bit for anyone who wants to add something.
Thank you to everyone for
Noah?
being here and to the Halivni family. Yeah.
Rabbi Grodowski, I'm going to add one word to what you said, and that's simply that Rabbi Halivni spoke about exactly the issues that you were referring to in terms of the reality of life versus the letter of the law, and he called it Torat Chaim versus Torat Emet. And we can talk about it more at another time, but he was well aware of what he was doing.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You know, I like I said, in each of those stories, one could write a treatise on why each one of those things are exactly what Torah and Halacha would call for us to do. But I think I sensed from him in those moments it was important not to give that treatise.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you. This is Deborah McCauley, and I'm in Newark, New Jersey. I want to speak about 1980-81, which was my first year as a doctoral student in Bible at Columbia, which means most of my courses were over at JTS. And prior to being at Columbia, I was privileged to study for 3 years at Harvard under Thomas Oden Lambden, blessed memory. He passed 2 years ago. And I never studied with Professor Halivni, but I had friends who did. And that first year, because I and another friend by the name of Lowell Gallen, who was entering the second year of the rabbinical school at JTS, had done some work in the field of Jewish-Christian relations. And because being a doctoral student in the religion department at Columbia, that allowed me to live at Union Seminary, which worked because all my classes were right there at that corner. I learned who the director of worship was at Union Seminary. So Lowell and I were thinking that perhaps it would be good for to have a Yom HaShoah service at Union Seminary. And we wrote a little proposal, and together we approached the director of worship, and she considered it because there was this chapel, this large stone chapel right there that had been refurbished. And she said yes. So we put together this service, and Lowell approached Professor Halivni to ask if he would participate. And this is what I want to share. He said no. He said that, and this is secondhand, I got it from Lowell. He said that he didn't go to JTS's Yom HaShoah service. But here's what was so striking. He explained why. He didn't assume that we would know and then would surmise. He very explicitly explained because of his life as a young man, as a teenager in the camps and what he endured. It was simply too difficult. And I never forgot that. I hardly remember the service, but I remember that Professor Halivni wanted to tell us why, and that was a unique mark of character. But then a few years later, I got his first book, Midrash, Mishnah, and Gemara, The Jewish Predilection for Justified Law. And what he was doing, he wouldn't speak apodictically, just say no and have us surmise. At the very time he was writing this book, it was deep within him that the why is important, and the saying why is divine. And so he allowed himself to be vulnerable by telling us explicitly why he would not come. Now, here's the second thing. Lowell and I did not know that no Christian seminary had ever had a Yom HaShoah service until Union. And JTA, Jewish Telegraphic Agency, picked that up. It went all over the globe that a Christian seminary had held a Yom HaShoah service with a Christian of culpability. And now today, you can't find a seminary, divinity school, or a theological school that does not have a Yom HaShoah service. So, yes, we remember the Shoah.
Thank you. Thank you. We just have time for perhaps one more. Anyone? Well, then again, I'd like to thank everyone for attending and to thank everyone who spoke and shared their thoughts, and especially to thank all those people who made the program possible, one by envisioning it and carrying that vision through, and also by supporting it financially. I think this program has been a blessing to and an inspiration to all of us. And I also invite you to consult the UTJ website and to also look for future programs which are being planned by UTJ, some of which will have to do with Rav Weiss Halivni. Once again, thank you, and may his memory be truly a blessing.